Moshik, welcome to Cassandra.
Oh, thank you, Armin, for having me.
So, Moshik, you, before we dive in, you studied leadership throughout history for many decades. Can you take us back a little bit, like where it all started and a little bit about your background?
Okay, you scared me for a while with the decades. I'm old, but not that old. So, well, my background is I'm trained as a historian of American history and international history, and the connection actually between the U.S. as a rising power, mostly in the 20th century, and the rest of the world, and that's where I got my academic start. I got my PhD at Columbia University. I studied with the great historians who were there, Alan Brinkley, Ira Katznelson, and several others. And eventually, after a stint teaching in New York and another stint teaching in Paris, I got my first serious academic job as a professor at Harvard at the Kennedy School of Government.
Right.
Which is a fascinating place. It was and still is a fascinating place. And there I encountered a challenge. Like most academically trained historians, I'm used to teaching history, which I find inherently interesting and intrinsically interesting just for studying the past. But here I had students who were not academic historians. They had, they had no intention of becoming historians like me. What they wanted to do was focus on leadership. They wanted to be leaders in their fields, in whether they were in public policy or in business or in government, in military, and in medicine. Many education, many fields that people there are in come from all over the world. They're of different ages and different backgrounds, but they're not accustomed to studying history for these purposes. They study economics, they study statistics, they study things like that. So I had to find a way to
get them interested.
To get them in the classroom. Right? These are electives that I'm teaching, and I don't want to have 4 or 5 students. I like to have a nice big audience. So it started out very instrumentally. I figured, look, these are young people who really want to learn about history, and I thought, what is a better laboratory for studying history than the past? Because that's where the past gives us everything that can possibly happen to us. There's an iteration of it that happened in the past. And so I started by constructing a course in which I would highlight the leadership component, or take the leaders from cases that I had already been working on, teaching, writing about, and teaching them leadership from these various cases. And that was the birth of the course that I started there, which was Leaders and Leadership in History. So it started with me kind of trying to find my way into the hearts and minds of these public policy leadership students. And then it, as we say in the business, it took on a life of its own, because the course exploded. I started quite small, and then from semester to semester, it just grew exponentially. Started having dozens, sometimes hundreds of students, and I had to, cap it, and I had to find bigger rooms, and it just I saw that there was enormous interest in it. And eventually it became global as well. I started teaching it in China, in India, in South Korea, in Mexico, France, other places. And so that's sort of my professional trajectory, from being a historian interested in leadership to an actual professor of leadership, where I've kind of developed the experience and the exposure of a really wide variety of people from different backgrounds, not just students, but people also in other, walks of life, who are interested in leadership. They're interested in leadership, their own leadership. Of course, they want to become leaders, or they are already leaders, but they want to develop their leadership, they want to improve, they want to reflect, they want to advance, but also people who are looking at the world and trying to examine what kind of leadership to choose, what kind of leadership to follow, right? There are people who are searching, not just for their own path, but for a collective path. They want to know, given the challenges that we have, given the problems that we face, given what the future might hold, who are the people that I should be in association with? Who are the people in whose footsteps I should follow, right? And again, the past, I think, offers us great lessons.
Yes.
Because that's where we see the pitfalls, and that's where we see the people who succeeded or failed, right? And I think that's where now, that's my zone. That's what I do.
And you really bring, by doing that, you bring history to life, right? Because like you make it more applicable to someone else when they're looking at their own lives and so on and so forth. I'm always reminded that like one of the most famous books from, at least like some of the communities that I'm involved in is really The Lessons of History by Will Durant, which is like one of the, I guess, famous ones when you look at like patterns. And here it's really about leaders. And most people, and we before we hit the record button, we quickly talked about this, that most people look at, leaders or past, be it a CEO or political leader in terms of, okay, what kind of traits, what kind of qualities, what kind of decision has this person made that I can maybe mimic? And what you brought up in a very kind of nice way, and I would love that you are kind of, giving us a little bit of, background on this, is you asked the question very much in the beginning, do leaders make history, or does history make leaders? So could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. So I think you're absolutely right. We have a question in front of us. You've phrased it: do leaders make history, or does history make the leaders? That's one of the first questions I asked the first time I taught the class.
Right.
And I remember it just popped into my mind as a question. I hadn't planned it, just thought of it, and I saw the reaction. It was actually a challenge. People had very strong opinions one way or another, and I think we have a tendency in our culture nowadays to really focus on the individuals and to look at their individual qualities and the trajectory of their lives as the determinant factors in whether they succeed or they fail. And as leaders in particular, whether they were able to master their circumstances, whether they were able to change the world or even change whatever it is, their institution, their company, their community, what have you. So I'm obviously very interested in those things because I examine various leaders and I want to see what it is about them that gives them the qualities or the skills to emerge in the first place as leaders. Is it is it communication? Is it charisma? Is it, there's a whole variety of things that we could go through to see like a checklist, right? But I discover, and I think those who study with me or work with me discover, that it's not just about the individual. It's about the interaction between the individual and the surrounding, in the individual and the historical circumstance, that it often makes the difference between, for example, a great and famous transformative leader and someone that no one today will study or hear of.
Could you give us an example, like a case study on that?
Sure. Well, one case study I can give you is, we were actually chatting about this before, during the Great Depression of the 1930s. which I think, people have heard of the Great Depression. They might know about the Great Depression, but I don't think people realize just quite how bad the Great Depression was. It wasn't just like an economic crisis of, there's our credit rating has been downgraded or something.
Yeah, it's not like nowadays where the central bank always helps. But
there's no bailing out. There's no This is a situation where where first nationally and then globally there is a true economic freefall. And when I say freefall, it means that people lose everything, and a society goes into a spiral of decline. Now, when that happens, and you find yourself with things like 25 to 30% unemployment, just imagine what that is in a modern society, modern, advanced, industrial, Western society, for example. What kind of political and social fallout there would be from that? What it is like to experience such fear and crisis. So we know, for example, that in Europe at the time, the continent basically went in the direction of dictatorships. We know that there is a direct lead-in. Everybody has heard of Hitler and everybody has heard of the Nazis. They come to power in Germany as a direct result of economic freefall and runaway inflation having to do with the Depression. So it's a global crisis that has severe political ramifications. And in the United States, which is the origin of this crisis, at the time there was, when the crisis hits, the president is Herbert Hoover. Now, Herbert Hoover was considered to be a brilliant man. He had never held any public office. He was elected president in 1928 on the basis of what people considered to be just extraordinary abilities as a public servant, as a businessman, as an entrepreneur, who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps, as they say. He was a great manager. But when crisis hit, he turned out to be the wrong man at the wrong place at the wrong time. And it's not because he was an innately poor leader. It's just that for that situation, he turned out to be not the right kind of leader that a society needs. Instead, the subsequent president, who was elected in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt, who actually didn't have the same reputation coming in. He wasn't as highly regarded as Herbert Hoover had been, turned out to be the right kind of leader for a crisis, partly because of his confidence, partly because of his dynamism in creating policies that responded to a crisis. His ability to communicate with the people, with the public, was shown through at that time. And he was a fighter. I mean, he really turned out to be a fighter, which people didn't necessarily expect him to be. Now, if you had switched the situation between Roosevelt and Hoover and put Roosevelt in the time of peace, Hoover at the time of the Depression, then you might get the opposite effect. Right. I think that what you see in that case is that Franklin Roosevelt was the right kind of leader for a severe crisis. He might not have been the right kind of leader for a more stable situation, for a more peacetime situation. Whereas I think Hoover was the right kind of leader for a more managerial situation, where you're really trying to kind of stay the course. You know, the situation is stable, and you want to do well on that basis. And he was the right kind of person, but he was very popular before the crisis. And the crisis hits, and that completely changes. So this is an example of two leaders that I don't even want to say, well, one was great and the other was not. But I want to point out that the way that we remember them as transformative, or in one case as Roosevelt and the other not so, really has to do with the circumstances in which they operated, and not only with innate qualities and individualism, which I think are important. But I also think, as a general comment, Armin, we have to keep in mind, and it's hard, people find it sometimes a difficult message to swallow, because we are so proud of ourselves. We accomplish things, right, with our two hands, and no one helps us, and we do it on our own, and we struggle, and it's all we are in a very individualistic society. And I'm just as, guilty of it as anyone else.
Sure.
But it's very important to remember that we are also part of a world. We're part of a community wherever we are. We have friends and associates, we have family. We have schools that we go to. We have people that we know. We have institutions that we belong to. We have things that are happening around us all the time that we interact with. So we are part of a society, and we're part of collective groups of people. And often the way that we interact with these institutions and society and these collectives and other people is just as important, if not more important, than any innate qualities that we're born with, or that we somehow find inside ourselves over time. I don't want to denigrate that. That's important, but it's not the only thing.
And it sounds so obvious, right? When we say that, and when you think about it, I mean, how can you not shaped by your circumstances, right? Where you grew up, how you grew up, and so on and so forth, which kind of, is the puzzle is then, okay, obviously, why do we only read the biographies, and why is there not much more that describes the circumstances? And even more interesting, do we see patterns? They're like patterns in terms of which kind of circumstances fit which kind of leaders or characters or whatever traits that they possess that might be quite correlated to these circumstances. Do we see anything like that?
Well, I think that's the challenge, Armin. I started by talking a little bit about, the sorts of books even that people are generally exposed to or even seek out when they want to learn about leadership. So to give you a very simple example, when you go to the airport, and I'm sure everybody who's watching this goes to the airport often. Go to the airport, and there you have 2-3 hours to kill on your connection. So you wander into the bookstore, and you go to the shelf of the bookstore at the airport. And I'm deliberately talking about the airport bookstore because that is the
bestseller list.
They're trying to sell books. I mean, just like they're trying to sell everything in that airport, right? So look at those books. You'll see the biographies in particular. They are quite successful. And as soon as you start reading, also the autobiographies, which are a particular kind of genre, right? People telling their success stories. Mm-hmm. When you start reading them, you read about, here's what they did when they were in school, and here's what they did when they built their first business, and here's what they did when they got elected mayor, and it's always about the individual action. And I'm left often wondering, well, okay, who else is responsible? Who helped this person, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not just talking about, the father or the mother. I'm talking about people that we never heard of or that aren't even mentioned in the book. I mean, we're not islands. We're human beings. Humans are fundamentally social creatures. We engage with other people. We engage with the world around us. It's just who we are as a species. And I found that that literature, which is very common, is not strong on this at all, and leaves us wondering. So that's partly what I try to do, is to not to forget the individual, but to highlight the interaction between the individual and the circumstances, not just the circumstances, not just the individual, but that relationship. Okay, so I think that's the fundamental thing. And in terms of what we learn from this, if patterns is one way of looking at it. We historians don't believe that history, people like to say history repeats itself. Actually, history does not repeat itself.
But it rhymes, no?
History can, well, yes, there is that thing that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Maybe. I think that what really matters is that history does give us insight into something very important. it gives us insight into us, because
Mm.
humans are the ones who are doing things in the past, and we are humans. There are things that are eternal. For example, competition for material resources, struggle for power, economic cooperation, ideas that people have about the world and about the meaning of life, culture, art, music, writing. These are things, just these things that I mentioned are eternal. They are perennial. They have been part of human existence from the beginning of recorded time until today. So when we look at what human beings did in the past, we're not just learning about the past, we're learning about ourselves as human beings. How do we respond to different crises? How did we, not them, we, because there's a continuity. How did we deal with challenges? When did we fight wars? When did we make peace? When did we emphasize this kind of political ideology? When did we emphasize that kind of political ideology? Just as examples. So when you read about the past, and that's something that I think I gained insight into just by teaching students who were engaged with the present and the future,
Sure.
right? That's where you see the connection. It's not that it's straightforward that I would say, well, here's how people dealt with the economic crisis of 1873. So that means that that's how we should deal with the economic crisis of 2023. No, it's a little bit more sophisticated than that, because the situation in 1873 is different from the situation in 2023. But what you do see is how we respond to different kinds of crises. What worked or didn't work? What kind of leaders emerged in particular moments? What kind of leaders disappeared in particular moments? And I think that those things, they don't repeat themselves exactly, but you see that our ancestors, as it were, are not too different from us, and we're not too different from them.
So what you're saying then, there are, for certain circumstances, certain traits that at least rhyme, right? Let's say there is the crisis leader that probably is very different from the manager that we, had with Hoover and Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you look at, and obviously because people are listening this for selfish reasons, they want to improve, they want to get ahead in their own careers and ambitions. So when we look at these traits, are there any kind of, is there kind of a way how we can emulate certain things, like, or do you see general patterns that, like, we can say, okay, so let's look at the circumstances in this kind of situation. Probably you need this kind of leader, right? Because they need to get out of, they need to get you out of the hole, or whatever it really is, right? Like, is there anything like that, like, some generalized kind of things that we observed, even though it's always more complex, we never have the counterfactual and of these historical patterns and so on and so forth, but, like, is there anything like that?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's selfish to want to do well, to advance, to have a good life, to have a good career, for people to accomplish their dreams. I'm assuming that the dreams are not harmful to others. That's my assumption. I always go by that. I also confess that I want people to have the best of both worlds. What I mean by that is that for people, in all honesty, people who want to learn just to make a lot of money, I'm probably not, they don't need me for that, because that's not, although I've had people who have been very successful in in business, in the corporate world, the private sector, and so on. So it's not a contradiction. And just people who are thinking only about their own individual success.
I guess it's more about like, always people want to make an impact. So, like, and they are looking obviously for these kind of patterns, right?
I think that people who are looking at the possibility of making an impact both publicly and personally, that's the ideal that I'm always looking for. So how do you get ahead? How do you succeed? But the getting ahead and the success are part of an ambition to make an impact, a positive impact, a public impact, making the world better. I know that might sound corny, but I really believe in that. And I think that again, just to go back to the earlier point, for me, there's no contradiction between wanting to do well, to thrive personally, and to also see the world around us getting better. There's no reason why why am I saying this, Armin? Because I think that people, even if they don't realize it, they often are operating under the assumption, and sometimes it's almost unconscious, that there is actually an inherent competition between ourselves and others. We are always in competition with others. And there's somehow, if we are focused on the outside of us, we're focused on the world, we're focused on the collective, we're focused on other people, then we lose out. We as an individual, I lose out. I sacrifice. I just don't think that's true. And I see it with the people that I've worked with over the years, that I've taught or that I've worked with. It's simply not true. It sometimes the contrary. The most rewarding work and the most remunerating work also is often most public-facing work, or the ones that are making an impact on their own careers as well as on the world at large. And then in terms of patterns, I would say, if there's one thing I would identify, it's connected to that point, which is those leaders who are most aware of their surroundings, who make the most effort to know what's going on around them, immediately around them, but also in the world. It can be in the society that they're operating in. It can be in the country that they're based in. It can be in the world at large. Those are the ones who tend to have the most success. Ones who know people best. And the ones that know people best, in my experience, and here I may be a bit skewed, are the ones who know history best. Because to know history well is to know people. That's what history is. That's what history is. History, I once had a student say to me, I gave a lecture, and a student, actually in China, said to me came up at the end of the lecture and said, "Well, Professor Temkin, I really like the way you teach history, because you really emphasize the human side of history." And I asked him, what other side of history is there? That's what we're doing. We're looking at human beings. That's what history is. There are geologists who look at the history of the earth. There are other kinds of, astronomers are looking at the history of the universe. Historians, including historians of leadership, are looking at the history of human society. That's what we study. So when you study history and you study it consciously, trying to see the connections between the past and the present, and therefore also between the past and the future, then you gain the most insight into human behavior and into people. Once you understand those things, once you can you see things around you and you recognize it from the things that you studied, from cases that you looked at, that gives you confidence that is just worth its weight in gold. And in my experience, that's really instrumentally what history can give you. Okay, so looking at leadership through history is very different from looking at leadership as a kind of formula because this is another thing
Right.
that people often do. It's like there are formulas to leadership, there are principles, there's like tips about how to be a. What has worked? What did people do in the past? Let's be realistic. Let's be concrete. Well, here's history that actually shows us these things empirically, not theoretically. And that's what we try to do. I mean, that's what leadership in history means for me.